On today's podcast, Eoin Everard. Eoin has a PhD in biomechanics, is a chartered physiotherapist and a pretty elite level runner. I'm an old man with a bad back, so we had plenty to talk about. Enjoy the conversation. Eoin, welcome to the podcast.
Mark, thanks so much for having me on. Really looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. We got in touch with each other. Basically, we kind of bonded over my terrible back. I think you saw some of my content where I was moaning about how much pain I was in and reached out and said, oh, I know about that. I've been contacted by other people about their bad backs more than any other kind of injury-related topic I've ever dealt with. It seems that every other person has either got a bad back or has had a bad back or is worried about getting one at some point. So basically, my question is, what's wrong with the human body that part of it seems to break all the time?
Yeah, it is crazy like that. 80 to 85% of us will have at least one back pain episode in our life. And then of those 80 to 85% of people, 30 to 35% of people will have like reoccurring back problems. So that's a massive percentage in the population.
Yeah. I
think it's a lot of like our kind of that's in the Western world, and it's this sedentary activities like Gray Cook and Mike Boyle talk about this kind of thing called the joint by joint approach. But a lot of different people have said the same thing, like the body takes the path of least resistance. Vladimir Janda would have his stuff in Eastern Europe. And the idea essentially is that joints have like primary one function. So like the foot arch should be quite stable. The ankle should have good mobility. The knee is a hinge joint. It should only like flex and extend. The hip is a ball and socket joint. So that's where you should get a lot of your range of motion. The lower back inherently should be quite stable. Like there's only about 4 degrees of rotation. The upper back should have like good extension and good movement. That's where the rotation should come from. The neck from like C2 to C7 should be quite stable. C3. So C2 and C1 at the very top are the ones that where all the movement really should come from the neck. Shoulder blade should be stable. Shoulder joint should be mobile. Why I go into that is that with modern living and sitting and everything else, we get this like reversal of those. So the joints that should be mobile tend to stiffen up. So if we're sitting at the hips, and then the joints that should be stable have to move too much because we're not that evolved from cavemen or cave women. So our primary function will always be able to move, because in life it would be like, well, we need to move to get food, we need to move to get safe. So we don't have the luxury of, if we're getting stiff in a certain area or we're not moving the way we should in that area, we never would have had the luxury to, let me get this right and not move through the other area. So I'm a chartered physio, as you know, so I will see so much more knee pain and back pain because they are the joints that are essentially moving too much and compensating more. And hip pain really only becomes a bigger issue. Like if the actual hip has been so stiff that it's kind of like arthritic now and needs more like, needs like a surgery or needs something to move. Now, that's not to say people don't get hip pain. They do. And we fix that. But like you'll see way more back pain because people aren't moving as the way they should through the hips. And then they have to move excessively in the back the way it's not really designed. And that's why we get that pain. And the same you'll see in runners. If we're stiff in the hips and we're trying to run, a lot more knee pain will be there than ankle stiffness or hip stiffness.
So we might be kind of jumping ahead in terms of things I want to cover here, but does that mean that kind of cultures where the lifestyles are not as sedentary as ours are don't have bad backs in the same way?
Not in the same way. Like there's good research showing that like cultures who don't use like our kind of Western toilets have way less like back problems and way less like hip problems and way less hemorrhoids. It's because they're going essentially into like this deep hip flexion, right, at least once a day, So yes, they have a lot less, which is kind of keeping that natural mobility in the hips. It's also a better way to like go to the toilet as well.
Well, you can even buy, can't you? And you can buy in the West, as it were, the kind of the footstools that raise your feet. Yeah, indeed, to give you a more natural position, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, because it has the better angles. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, they have way less back pain, and they think that might be one of the reasons they keep that hip mobility much more. So then, like as you said, your body will always be able to move. So a lot of us are just moving excessively through the lower back.
It's interesting because when I kind of think about, I don't know, like maybe, I don't know, an African tribe sat around a fire to kind of stereotype horrifically, but they would all might be sat in there like a deep squat. That
Yeah.
would be just a typical way of sitting or at least resting. Whereas we would never think to just sit in a deep squat. That would be a very strange way of resting. You'd sit in a chair.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
suppose we should be, I guess, when we need to just rest and chat and just shoot the breeze, squatting down the way our ancestors would have done.
Yeah, and they're doing that from like an early age. They're developing that mobility, and then they're maintaining it. You know, like we lose a lot of that lateral like kind of flexibility as we go, where they're not losing it because they're using it every day. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, we would never think to sit like that. In fact, many people thinking about it. I know my wife, because she wore heels for years and years and years, simply can't. She couldn't squat down to the floor. She would her Achilles would be so tight, she would simply tip forward, and she'd tip forward into the campfire that she's supposed to be sat around. I mean,
yeah, exactly. And even with them, there's a knock on with high heels. So you go up on the hip, you bend the knee a little bit forward, the hips go into that anterior pelvic tilt, to kind of have that like, kind of definition of what aesthetically we're looking for. But that then again, moves us. There's a great line like, the chains of habit are too light to be felt until they're too heavy to be broken. And that's essentially what can happen here. We're doing things, not thinking they're changing things. Now, I do think they can be changed, but it's very difficult then, where it's like we're getting used to things, and all of a sudden, like, we can't move into that way, or then we kind of get afraid of that movement, which we really shouldn't. We just need to progress it back in a respectful manner. Now, that's where people sometimes go wrong here, especially with like our Instagram culture. It's like, we need to be doing this. It's like, okay, but if that's step 10 and you're at step 1, we need a kind of gradual progression there, because you do see, and we're going to talk about it later, like different exercises and people just kind of ignore the starting position of a lot of people.
Well, yeah, indeed. I mean, that social media fitness in a nutshell is that it's tailored towards demonstrating extremes that most people could simply never achieve without either staggering amounts of luck or time or drugs, whatever else it might be. And no one cares about the kind of the more moderate levels of fitness that are actually achievable and just better. I mean, I'm in an interesting place in my own fitness at the moment, where last year I got in very good shape and didn't find it particularly satisfying. I'm now spending this year trying to achieve more of a kind of a harmony between. It sounds very kind of I sound like a vegan ultra runner, but I'm trying to achieve a sort of a harmony where my body can work and operate in the world. I can go for a run, I can go for a cycle, I can need to go to shops, I can jog to get there. So yeah, I'm very focused at the moment on just trying to make my body work the way a human body is supposed to work, as opposed to what Instagram tells me a human body is supposed to do. Talking of my human body, I mean, for what you're saying, clearly Western culture, sitting down all the time, there's a whole bunch of things we're doing that are causing the body to not kind of operate the way it's supposed to. When I had an MRI done on my back to find out why it was so painful, it showed up a whole bunch of, well, I say problems. It showed up a whole bunch of things going on in my back that were suggestive of it being an older person's back, as it is. It's a 50-year-old back. It's not a teenage back. And so I have things like bulges in my discs, and I have what they literally referred to as degenerative disc disease and things like this. And everyone I've spoken to at reasonable levels of kind of expertise, physios and doctors and surgeons and so on, have almost kind of brushed it off as being, well, yeah, it's just, that's part of life. Your back is old and it's a bit worn down and weathered. And I'm curious as to whether that is literally the case, and every person's back just slowly deteriorates, and it really is no big deal, or if what they mean is, no, your lifestyle, that Western lifestyle, has caused your back to look like that, so it's typical. It's not actually good, though. Did you see the distinction?
Yeah, no, I think, I think we need to just use pain as the guide, essentially. Now, so MRIs can be useful in that, in terms of like to get like a confirming diagnosis, especially if someone is like presenting with very like disc orientated issues, and you're thinking like, is it drop foot? I like seeing like how big is the disc bulge. I think there's a couple of things there. I think the first is, it's very important. I feel like a lot of the MRIs I get, the language is like just not, it's like Spanish if someone's an English speaker, it's not explained well.
Well, it was like scary Spanish, because I read it and didn't understand it, other than when you hear words like bulge and disease in relation to your spine. It just conjures up images of how long have I got left, walking around almost. I was kind of thinking I need a Zimmer frame on order or something.
100%. And disc degeneration is the first level down. It's just a little bit of wear and tear. It's not like anything to worry about. And then it goes to like a bulge. A bulge is like the disc is fine, but it's just the inside is kind of pushing on the outside, and that can hit the nerve. So there is like, with all these things, like the movement is medicine. There are things now, I would think there's things you should do to kind of counteract that. So in that case, when we're seeing these symptoms, I think it's important that we're addressing them, but we're not worried about there's always this debate in like kind of with back rehab or back exercises. Is it just do what you're normally doing and don't like that you want to empower people? But I feel like you can empower, people are more empowered, I feel, if you give them like exercises that make them feel better, and you tell them like, look, when you do this, this is why it's sore. So if you stop doing that, and if you educate them that way, like sometimes people think on the way I'm doing it there, that you're telling them, look, if it's a bulge, the first hour in the morning, let's be careful. If, watch the amount of sitting you're doing. Here are the type of exercises I would recommend. That like you're scaring them into doing exercises. And that's not the case. Their back is healthy. Their back is strong. That's really important to know. But I think it's important to, with a PhD in biomechanics, understand like these are the mechanics that are going on, and these are what we want to address. That is one thing with the MRI. The second thing, though, it is important to realize just general MRIs on your back can be a little bit misleading. So MRIs on the back have about a 50% false positive ratio. What does that mean? If we took 100 people, of those 100 people, we split them in, and 50 have back pain and 50 don't. If we MRI'd everybody in the group that had back pain, 25 of those, so half would have their MRI look clear, the back would look really healthy, and half would have like disc degeneration, disc bulges, like wear and tear, stenosis. If we took the 50% who didn't have back pain and we MRI'd them, half would have backs would look perfect, half would have degenerations, disc bulges, etc. So it's just understanding that they can be useful sometimes in the acute sense, but just getting MRIs on your back and being told, oh my God, you have degeneration, or you have like a disc issue. Like I literally, on my sports Pilates, we do kind of Q&A calls, and a lady was told like, you have very bad like degeneration on the spine there and her back, and she's 64 doing the Pilates, and like her pain is getting a lot better. She's kind of started recently. So she's like, no, it was sore even walking, and now my hip feels way better. I'm like, you're on the right lines. And she's like, yeah, because when I was in my late 20s, I got an x-ray at that stage. And at that stage, they were really worried about the wear and tear and degeneration that was there. Yeah. And now she's nearly here 40 years on, and have had no problem, no real issues with it. So you just don't want to get scared by that. You just want to understand that a lot of people who have never have back pain will never have back pain. if they look at their MRIs, they'd be worried. And other people who have crippling back pain can have clear MRIs. Because a lot of times, I don't know, like, stop me here if this is getting boring, but for example, right, on an MRI, a lot of times the problem is, I find, like, it's the movement, it's the way we're moving that's causing irritation. So, for example, if I pull back my finger, that would get very sore. So sometimes there's an opposite thing that can happen with people with MRIs that I see, is where the person has back pain, they get an MRI, and the MRI is saying you have no problems. And they're nearly a little bit disappointed because they're like, it's not in my head, I have this pain. And I was like, you do, you know? So a lot of times if I pull that back, this finger, and it's new, and then I get an MRI, that would be clear. But it's the way I'm holding it that's causing the pain. So it's like getting used to like holding in a better position. The other thing with an MRI that's funny is, right, if I'm moving here, and that's fine, but over time then that would degenerate, and sometimes then that's causing, say, a disc bulge. That level would stiffen, so that bulge would be fine because the joint would be stiff, so you wouldn't move through there. You know, we're saying that the low back a lot of times is inappropriate excessive movement, so that stiffens, and the joint above it then starts to move. So if you've got an MRI, then it would be like, oh yeah, this one is the issue, but now you're actually getting pain in the one that's not showing up any issue. Does that make sense? This one is nearly fused. Yes. It's nearly fused itself. And this one now is where the work is. So we could be working on we call them L because the lumbar is the lower back, say. So say if we just, for this, we'll call it, it could be an L4, L5 that's showing an issue on the MRI. But now the problem could be like between L3 and L4. You know, so it's just understanding the limitations of MRIs and not being overly worried about the wording, but also then sometimes, if it's more of an acute thing, they can be not useful sometimes to just give me an indication of what's going on.
Yeah, and that fits in with what I was told. It was almost that had there been something horrendous with my back, it would have been useful to see it, and it would have shown it. But the fact that there was nothing particularly exciting didn't kind of mean much either way. It was yeah, as you say, they have their place, but just not. I went into it thinking this machine is so big and sexy and expensive looking that it can't fail to sort of cure me, or not cure me, but I don't, you know, this is like Star Trek, scan me and tell me exactly what's wrong, and instead it just said, yeah, you're a bit old. Well, I knew that. I knew that when I arrived. Something you mentioned earlier, you said movement is medicine. Which is interesting because I followed the approach of movement hurts, so I won't do anything. So when I first hurt my back, which would have been last autumn, as it got progressively worse because I did nothing about it, I did progressively less. And it got to the point where basically we sort of went into Christmas, December time, and I discovered that lying really still was fine. And so I did that for a couple of months almost. I hardly moved. And during that period, my back would go from being fine, because I'm lying still and doing nothing, to just spasming and locking me up. Just because, for example, I went to the cinema one evening, I watched a movie, and at the end of it, I couldn't get out the chair. And it was insane. I had to wait for everyone else to leave because it was embarrassing. And my wife had to kind of pull me out of the seat. And that's not good. You have an age gap relationship in the first place when she has to then pull you out the chair. That you're thinking, oh, this isn't looking good. So I'm assuming that it is as straightforward as thinking, oh, it hurts, so I'll stay real still, is about as bad as you can get in terms of ways to make things better.
No, it's not very, because what you did is the most common response. Because yeah. And like, if it's an acute problem, that's not an issue. Like, you know, if you roll your ankle, stay off it for a few days, let the pain be the guide, and then gradually get back into it. With a back pain with a spasm, we're going to try that, the same thing. Now, like, I think also we still want to do, what we want to do is like appropriate exercise. So we want to find kind of like pain-free to a certain extent, ones that we can get away with. So if I was back talking to Mark in November, I'd be like, okay, can we do, like, I have a 5-minute morning routine. Can you do the 5-minute morning routine without it spasming? Yes, okay, that's what we do. Can we then do power walking, like, swinging your arms?
Which I'm now, yeah. In fact, I now do that every morning religiously. I get out of bed and I make sure that within 5 or 6 minutes of getting out of bed, I'm in the street and I'm walking and as you say, I'm using my arms. I even clip the dog onto my belt so that my arms are free to swing my arms. And
That's right. Just why that works is from your glute, from your bum across. It's called like the latissimus dorsi has this like very strong fascia layer across it, and then that can kind of attach into the opposite shoulder. So if you essentially are like when you're moving your leg forward, as you move the opposite arm forward, you're essentially putting a stretch on that. So if you can think, that's like one band of an X. And then when we do the other side, so we're putting this like X or support through the lower back and getting things moving. So it's just like really kind of putting a support or brace through it. So I recommend power walking to everybody, especially in the morning. We can talk about morning in the why it's important in a minute, but that's important. Then I would probably leave that for like a week or two just to gain confidence. Is like, look, I can do a walk and I can do my little 5 minutes in the morning and that seems fine. And then what I would add in is like, say we have the back aware belt or our back Pilates, like a little 35-minute session to strengthen up the core muscles again, because the weird thing about the knee and the back is there's two different types of muscles that we have. We have these things called local, kind of like the stabilizing muscles. And then we have the global, like bigger muscles that are more for movement. Because we're not that evolved from cavemen or cave women, when we contract, when pain comes, the local muscles tend to switch off and the global muscles can come on. Because again, if I damage myself when I was like a caveman, I nearly need to make like a splint. So it's like, it's easier if the bigger muscles just like clamp it down. And it's like, look, we'll worry about if this is how we're going to move or get around in the future. But for right now, I want to make sure I'm not causing any other damage. But so we're very good at contracting in, but we're not good at like then getting the subtleties back. And that's why we do the Pilates maybe just once a week. And then that would allow a much better management strategy. Because the other thing with back pain is it generally isn't like you have back pain, you have no back pain. I say to people, it's like waves. The waves get smaller so that essentially like the pain you experience gets less and the distance between the waves gets more. But the waves do come, like if you sit for ages, like, or do something that's going to irritate it, your back will get sore. And what I want for my clients or my patients is like a management strategy, which is much more important, that they're like, okay, if it spasms, I do my morning routine. I do my back relieving position, which is just lying on your stomach, hands on your forehead, breathe into your stomach, like so it doesn't rise through your chest, breathe out like that, kind of fogging up a mirror and trying to let the lower back muscles relax. You get back into your power walking, you leave it 2 weeks, and then you go into your Pilates. So it's not a catastrophizing thing, because if you don't know what to do, well, then you will just rest, because you're like, well, the only thing that I know is safe at the moment is staying perfectly still. And I can't trust any other exercise. And this is where, I know we talked about the Instagram, where I feel sometimes the thing of like, oh, you just tell the person to do whatever they want. It's like, it's just naive to what a normal person's thinking. They're like, give me guidance so I feel confident. Because they would think my side is like, it enhances fear. But I'm like, I don't think so. I think people want safety rails. They're like, I can do this bit. I feel that's trust. That's level 1. Then I'll go to level 2, level 3. And then I can do my Jefferson curls, or I can do all these things you're talking about if I feel like that's what it is. But just telling me to do a Jefferson curl or telling me to do any old exercise you want when it spasms my back is not giving me confidence to do anything. And it's like the opposite.
Yes, exactly the position I was in. The pain was so debilitating when it spasmed. I mean, I literally was lying on the floor and couldn't move around, and even lying still was hurting. That was so debilitating that the idea of doing any sort of exercise was just terrifying. I was thinking, if I go and do whatever, a little bit of light ski erg or something, or rower, I'm going to just lock my back up. And I had visions of of having to, I was thinking, how am I going to, if I'm locked up and have to go to A&E, how am I going to physically get into the car? And, I stopped riding my motorbike because I was terrified I'd lock up and just kind of ride into a tree or something. So yeah, the idea of doing any exercise just off my own back was just impossible. I needed someone to say, it will be okay to do X, Y, Z. And as you say, I then got up and with the confidence of someone having told me, was able to get on and do X, Y, Z. And before I knew it, everything kind of falls into place. But people think I'm some sort of fitness expert. I'm a million miles from it. I still need to be told, and even if I were, it wouldn't matter. Everybody finds it comforting to be told, do this and it will be okay. That's just, what better thing to hear? Yeah.
100%. And like you said, I think it's like, look, if you do X, Y, Z, you do it and then you feel confident. It's like, okay, at least I have that. Now we can go for like, the ABC or the, EFG, whatever the next steps are.
Yes.
But we're like, okay, at least I got these. I proved that. As opposed to someone saying, yeah, just do anything on the alphabet. And you're like, here, if I do anything, it's going to spasm again. That's how.
Well, indeed, I knew that. Yeah. Once I knew that I could get to 11 o'clock in the morning through just a morning routine and some power walking, it then meant that in the afternoon, as I did today, I could jump on my bike and go for a bike ride. And I don't worry too much about it because even if my back does hurt after that or spasms during it, I know that I can just fall back to tomorrow, get up and just go for a power walk and as opposed to being right back to square one or square zero even, which is just lying on the sofa not able to move. Interesting. Morning routine and we're going to, this is going to now sound like sort of a Hoopman podcast, but morning routine, is there something that, or are there things that anybody, irrespective of their back right now, should just be doing, like get up and brushing your teeth? You should be doing stuff. The thing I notice a lot is that, for example, my dogs, every time my dogs get up, they stretch. They must stretch 20 or 30 times a day. They're constantly stretching. And I've never yet owned a dog that when I threw a stick for it, it had to either warm up or tore something when it ran after it. They always do appear to be ready to go. So I like the idea of, I've got into the habit of doing that. For example, I'm sitting down now talking to you, but when this is finished, I'll stand up and I do some stretching. I've just got into the habit now of stretching during the day. So go back to the morning. What when we roll out of bed should we be doing aside from getting up and being active and walking if we can? Are there particular stretches that are useful? And also kind of tying in with that, why sometimes do I wake up in the morning feeling worse, just feeling stiff and achy? It's as though overnight my body didn't rest and recuperate. It somehow stiffened up. And I'm curious as to what's going on in my sleep that's causing that.
So when we're during the day, we are putting a compressive load down with gravity. So essentially the discs are losing a bit of height. When we sleep, because we're not compressing, there's less pressure down and down. So the discs kind of expand and more fluid comes into the discs, like
which
blood
sounds
and
a good
whatever
thing.
else.
Right.
It is a good thing. But if you have a bulge in the disc, which is like just the outside is a little bit irritated and it's pushing out against the nerve, if you had a full bottle of water, if you press on the sides of a full bottle of water, water is going to shoot out. If you pour it out and the bottle is only 3/4 full, you can press on the sides with the same pressure and no water is going to flow out.
Right.
So people, you see it a lot. I see it a lot with my back Pilates and stuff like that. People are like, they do my back routine and they're like, I can't put on my shoes and socks because they can't bend forward. Because imagine if the disc is full, if they're pressing on one side and the bulge is this way, so it's like a flexion bulge, they're like, because it's full, that type of pressure is pushing out against it. So what we want to do is our 5-minute routine in the morning, which is like your cobras essentially, a little bit of cat camel, but don't go up into the camel part. You're really just going into the like pain-free range. And then we do like just one kind of core exercise to kind of like stabilize. And then when I put on my porridge or oatmeal for our in the microwave for US guests, say I'll open my hall door and I will power walk from the microwave to the front door and back for that like 2 minutes inside, swinging my arms, turning, going again, because that again is putting that compressive force down and reducing the fluid in the disc. So that first hour, you don't want to be lifting super heavy. If you are going on like long drives, say you have to commute to work and you have disc problems, that's we'll talk about what to do sitting, but that's a really big thing. In Ireland, we have this saying in Irish, it's called tu smat latna hibra. And what that means is a good start is half the work. And that's really the case with disc pain. Like much more than any other, like a morning is a good time to do exercises because it's the first thing you're out. It's nearly like that book, like Eat That Frog, do the thing you just don't want to do early. But for any other injury, really, it's like you could do it at any time of the day. With a disc, it's really the only one where it's like there's a fundamental change to the structure in the morning that you want to reduce to help you during the day.
What's interesting though, you mentioned, so that I get the compression during the day, and then overnight things relax and fluid comes back in.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about your morning routine, almost kind of reintroducing some degree of compression and that helping.
Yeah.
So does that mean that things that I do, like hanging upside down, which is designed to decompress, is that as good as people that sell hanging upside down machines? Is it as good as they would suggest? Or is kind of uncompression or decompressing, is it all it's cracked up to be?
Later in the day, it's fine. It depends on what the issue is. If someone has, you could, again, if you have a little bit of stenosis, that's why I like let pain be the guide. So if it's the facet joints on the outside, they can be nearly too compressed, So what you're trying to do there is like essentially a gapping and an opening up of the joints, essentially. So again, if you think of overnight for 8 hours, there's a lot more blood flow. You weren't hanging out upside down for 8 hours, I hope. So like no. A traction for 10 minutes, a traction even for like an hour or 30 minutes is enough. It's what they're trying to do is a different thing. They're not helping a disc. You could argue if they're really trying to open it up, they're trying to increase it and nearly try getting like a suction back. I have no evidence for that but really what they're trying to do is more like gap the joints and help more of a joint issue than a disc issue. So it's kind of working on something slightly different.
Okay, so I can still hang upside down because I enjoy hanging upside
exactly,
down.
Yeah.
It's just
Look, with back pain, it's very simple. When you do it, if it kind of feels better, and if there's less pain after you do it, and there's less pain later on in the day, that's important because some back stretches, they're activating these things called like Golgi tendon. So, like for example, that child's pose stretch, that can feel very good because it's kind of released off the back. But if later, so people are like, oh, I have a disc problem, I do my child's pose stretch, it feels good on my back. But if like in an hour, 2 hours or later that day, the back feels like, that your back is a spasm or it's getting very painful, try remove that stretch and just see later in the day how the back feels.
Actually, it's interesting because my complete lack of understanding of basic anatomy, certainly at the beginning of my bad back process, was telling me that kind of child's pose, that those sort of stretches, basically bending forward in some fashion, was stretching the back, inverted commas, and therefore was beneficial to what I was trying to do. And I was thinking that the things like the cobra pose, obviously the kind of the invert of that was in some
bunching
way
it together,
kind of crushing the lower back. And so I was thinking, well, don't do that. And consequently, I was finding that when I was doing things like child pose, it was horrible. It was causing me just extreme discomfort. I don't do it anymore. I now do. For example, the cobra pose, I do a lot. I even sometimes when I'm trying to write scripts for videos and stuff. I have various kind of places around the house where I go and just spend 5 or 10 minutes having a kind of creative moment, hopefully. One of them is I'll go and lie on the floor and I'll prop myself up onto my elbows on a pillow and I'll just sit at my laptop, lie at my laptop, as it were, in a kind of cobra pose and just spend 5 minutes writing and always get up feeling just loads better, having decompressed the spine on the right side of it at least. Whereas previously my perception would have been that kind of bending the back that way, effectively going backwards, was in some way going to be squashing it.
Well, I think two things with that are, so if people can imagine, if I have like a burger of some sort, so I have the two top and the bottom, if I'm like pinching down on the left side, all the stuff is going to shoot out of the right side of the burger. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but what you're trying to do is, when we're doing the arching there, we are closing down the side that was too open. So now we go on the left side and we press down on that, and it's like jelly. We're just pushing it back into the middle, back to where it came from. So that's how the cobra is working. It's a really interesting one, right? Yes. How that came about to be discovered was, there was a physio called Robin McKenzie in New Zealand. And he was working with, he had his practice, and a patient with back pain came too early for a session. So he's like, go into the treatment and just hop on the bed. Now, the bed was upright. So he just thought he'll sit on the bed. So he'll sit with his legs out. But it had a face hole. So the guy then hopped on the bed. He put his face in the face hole and he was arched. And then Robin was late. So he's 15 minutes late. He's finishing up with the other person. He comes in and he sees this guy completely arched with his back. And he's like, oh my God. He's like, no, hop up. The guy gets up and he's like, oh yeah, that feels way better. And then he started looking into disc mechanics of why that could be the case. He's like, why the hell did he feel better after being in that position? Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting because that's basically the position I put myself in, prop myself up on a couple of pillows on the floor, and I sit and write for 5 or 10 minutes just in that kind of mild cobra position, and always get up feeling better than I got down. Something that I've encountered with seeing physios recently and also in the past, but definitely recently because I've been paying more attention, what I've tried to understand is the difference between things they're asking me to do that involve mobility and stretching and things they're asking me to do that involve strengthening, and whether one is more important than the other. Because something that I've, every time I go and see the physio, I saw one recently I saw the sports masseuse guy, and immediately he kind of prodded around and said, oh yeah, your hips are tight, psoas is tight. And I believe him because when he stuck his fingers in, I was screaming in pain. And also when he finished, I felt amazing. I have on my right hip, the front of my hip, I have almost feels like a groin strain, but as soon as I get psoas stretching done on it, the next day the pain's gone. It's I was going to say it's a miracle cure. It's not a miracle cure. I stretch it and it feels great. So he gave me a variety of stretches to do for the hips and so on. And he also gave me a variety of strengthening things to do, a hip flexor strengthening. And I wasn't quite sure kind of almost whether you simply put the two and two together and you need both, or whether one is more important than the other. Because his argument was that, and it seemed to make sense, you don't require your psoas or any of those hip flexor muscles to be incredibly flexible. You don't need huge flexibility in them. In fact, he was giving an example of people that he treats who are gymnasts who have massive flexibility but still suffer from pain and problems. But he was saying that strength is something that is a problem because we don't work hip flexion in that way. It's not saying we strengthen. So we're constantly trying to strengthen our hip extension in all manner of ways, whether it's doing squats or whatever it is. There's all sorts of exercises that involve extending the hip joint, but that hip flexion, we don't ever do it in a strengthening way. We just do it like I'm doing now, just static, sat here, hip flexors tight. So long-winded way of saying my hip flexors are a mess. Should I be stretching them, strengthening them, or just a bit of both?
Yeah, both. There's a lot of questions in that, so I'll just try to depack it for a minute. Okay, so it's good. All right, so first thing we say is it like there's a difference between flexibility and instability. So flexibility is the ability to like what we want is so we want to do both because we want to be able to move through our full range of motion. That's the flexibility in a controlled manner. That's the stability, and it's having both of those things together. So at the start of the call, we talked about why is there so much back pain, and one of the reasons we said is like people aren't moving well through the hips, and then they're moving too much through the back. So essentially, like for 90% of people, if we get better movement through the hips, and we stabilize them through the core, we're going to work. Now, when you're looking at movement in general, that ability to move through the full range of motion in a controlled manner, how do we achieve that? Well, there's three things you need. The first you need is mobility. You need and for mobility, there needs to be three things. I'll go through these quickly. If anything sparks or people afterwards want to ask me, we can come back and do a full call on this. But for mobility, it's usually like there could be spasm in it. So like in the psoas there, when he's putting his fingers in, he's releasing off like trigger points or spasm in the muscle, like the tightness there, like knots essentially. Could be then the muscle itself is in a shortened position, so it's tight and that needs then to be stretched. Or it could be the joint. It could be like, look, the hip flexor, the iliopsoas is fine, but it's the actual joint that needs more movement. Like it's the hip joint that's stiff, just for example. Then once we're achieving that, we want stability then. We want the control manner part. And again, we can do that with like, a lot of times the hip flexors can be weak. So we want then, once we're like, well, we can like physically move the hip up. There's no point working on that, like strengthening. It's like if you just physically that can't move. But once it can, you want to like, you can work on the strength there. And then we really want to be working on the strength of like the basic activation, like getting the core switched on again. As we said, with back pain, those deep core muscles can kind of switch off. Working on their glutes again, if we're sitting all the time, working on the strength. So just activating the right muscles. And then lastly, we want to look at motor control. And that's the awareness of your position. So learning the technique of things. So for example, if I'm looking to improve hip mobility, say even for the posterior hip, the glutes, it's one we do a lot of times is it's in a bridge, but we're dropping through the hip and back up. And I'm using like say my back wear belt, or I have my hand on my stomach, and I'm like not feeling, you shouldn't feel any change in the back, because a lot of us don't have the ability to like drop down and move through the hip joint, like true moving through the hip joint without compensating, without arching your back or rounding your back. Because remember, we're just used to moving through there because the hip has got stiff. So we're using like the range of motion we do need through the hip. We need then to be able to activate the core to hold. We need to be able to switch on the glute. But then we need to be able to practice like that fold. Just getting used to like, this is where the movement should be occurring, and getting that awareness of the body. And then we can do that in standing, say with like our hinging back, with like our single leg deadlifts or squats. It's like, okay, this should be occurring at the hip when the back shouldn't be moving. Or if we're doing pushes or any exercise, then it's like, can we do it in the area that's targeted? The hip flexor then, he's right, like a lot of times the hip flexor is only on that mobility piece, if even. Like people are sitting, they're not stretching it. And then a lot of times that inner range hip is actually more in spasm. So if you can release it the other way, lengthening it out, and then contracting it and working it in an inner range, it can really help like strengthen all around those hips, get that movement back. Because gymnasts are a good example. Sometimes people can be super flexible, but have a lot of like instability in the core, like not able to control the movement or not be able to bring their own leg through it. And if you can't, because of the strength, move your own leg, it's like you're still not going to naturally be able to do that action. You know, if we have someone who we can bring their leg up when we do it, or they can do it passively. But for example, if we talk about people who they're going to the toilet just with like a hole and not a toilet. They need the control to be able to like not fall over, as well as the mobility at the start. And it's the mobility, the stability, and the motor control. Now, if you're going to start, you work all of them all the way through, but the mobility is the first thing you need, the stability, and then the motor control. But in reality, in an actual program, you're working all three together.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and which is how that's kind of how I've set up my routine now in the gym. Is that I literally allocate time to doing certainly doing the mobility work, and then doing things under load, the exercises that I wouldn't normally have done. I mean, interestingly, actually, this is an interesting. Just to kind of go off on a tangent slightly. When I was a kid, a long time ago, fitness, just health and fitness, meant cycling or playing badminton or playing soccer, football. Very few people were going weight lifting in the sense they are today. There was bodybuilding, but it was niche. I mean, to say it was niche is an understatement. It was, if you said back in, I don't know, 1990, I want to be Dorian Yates. Most of your friends would have laughed at the idea, and yet nowadays, if you say you want to be Chris Bumstead, that's well, of course you do. So lifting weights has become a very routine thing in a way that it never was. Has the fact that people now who go to the gym, because again, to use me as an example, years ago I used to work in the gym. People would come in, they'd say, I want to start working out. We'd give them things to do, exercises to do, routines to follow. And never, ever did I prescribe someone, for example, deadlifts, that's just kind of walked in the door and said, I want to work out. It wouldn't even occur to me to do that. They probably wouldn't be doing heavy back squats. They wouldn't be doing things like glute bridges and stuff. I can't remember seeing anyone do a glute bridge back in 1990. I mean, I'm sure, again, bodybuilders would have been doing, but people weren't coming in saying, I want to be Mike Menster. That wasn't happening. But now, if you join a gym and you start kind of attracting gym content through your social media by the very nature of looking at it, you're going to get bombarded by it. If you could go from being someone that's never used a gym in your life to suddenly being shown daily, girls doing glute bridges non-stop, guys doing massive deadlifts, massive back squats and so on. Is there any, do you see in your career, in your profession, do you see any link between, in simple terms, Joe Bloggs going to the gym and training like a bodybuilder, and more people coming to you and saying, oh, I'm in pain? Is there a link?
It's balance. And I think what you're saying, I think it's important to recognize that social media has helped a lot that way, hasn't it? In terms of people wouldn't have been aware of good things to do, and now they can at least come there. So Ed Thomas, again, there's a few little things popped into my head, so I'm just going to go through them systematically. The first thing that I thought you were talking about is the nature of exercise, which was Dr. Ed Thomas has such a good series on this. And what he looks at is the history of exercise from the Greeks all the way through to modern life. And back in Grecian times and all the way through, basically till about the 1960s, when the sports hall became a big focus. But basically before that, the Greeks had if people who aren't watching this can think of one of those sand timers. So we got three, a thing on the top, a thing on the bottom, and then an X in the middle. So the three elements of exercise that were important were a restorative exercise, martial or military, and then pedagogy. So you should have some element of restoration in your program. You should have some element of the ability to attack and defend, which would be strength training. So you need to be strong, and then you need to have those skills. And then you have your cardiovascular, can you run a race? Can you play a sport? And the reasons for that were threefold. The reasons for exercise essentially were the personal, that if you believe like, you know, it's important that like you are fit and healthy as an individual. For social, which would essentially be, you shouldn't be a burden on society. So like you need to be like healthy to help us and then not be a burden back then. And then kind of like spiritual, essentially, that even if you don't believe in God or anything, it's that 1 in 4 trillion chance that like that egg and that sperm. So it's like a special gift not to ruin this. That would be, so you'd have the reason, the ethos of why to do it, and the execution. And then into the 1960s, that really tipped towards just the pedagogy, sport being like, and he talks really nicely about like the different cultures of how they would have kept these things going. But in the 60s, then the gyms got way like just a few machines, or just really like just a basketball hall in America. And this idea of like just playing sport being the issue. So as you said, in the 90s, it's like fitness essentially just is like you can run, or you play soccer or football, or you do this. So there has been a lovely resurgence of the ideas of like restorative and like, you know, strength being like having strength. So in that way, it's way better. It's a much better balance than people just playing sport until they can't, you know, they're finished in their 20s playing high level sport and then they don't know what to do, or they go running and that's all they do. You need that other balance. That being said, then the second thing, so that was the first I thought came into my head, that like in that way, we shouldn't be nostalgic about the past. I feel like because of Instagram, because of people talking about different things, people are much more informed and can have better balance in their program. So rather than the person just going running every day, now the person's like, I can go to the gym, I do my Pilates, I do yoga, I do these different types of exercise that I might never have heard of or been exposed to previously, but because things are around.
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting one. But just to kind of pick up on that, and I'm slightly hesitant to pick up on it because it's touching on subjects that I've been giving a lot of thought to lately, and are going to feature in some videos that are coming soon. But I haven't given enough thought to properly have a conversation about them. So we'll see how I go. I'm really interested in the idea that yeah, historically, certainly if you go back 100 years, people weren't doing exercise. People just weren't doing exercise. There were people would have been practicing to be better at their sport. There was clearly that. If you were involved in a sport, you would have been doing it to be better at it. But yeah, if you said to somebody, you know, randomly in 1910, 1920, even up into kind of pre-war, pre-Second World War, what exercise are you doing? I mean, it just wouldn't feature in most people's vocabulary. Even that exercise. Yeah, there's the famous King George quote: "Exercise. If you're sick, you shouldn't do it, and if you're healthy, you don't need it." And exercise, and you kind of think, well, you can see why, in a way, you have a point, because people were just they weren't exercising, they were just being human beings in 1910, which involved plenty of what we would now call exercise. Certainly involved plenty of use of their body. So they weren't exercising, they were just doing sport. What we've now got is, we've now got a huge number of people through social media pushing the idea of just exercising for you, for to make you, for the reasons you say, whether it's spiritual or mental health, or whether it's or just to be. I mean, a great reason is to be less of a burden on society. I mean, what's just happened with the pandemic in the last few years? If you click your fingers and suddenly have everybody on the planet exercising on a regular basis, that would have been a lesser issue. So that there's all sorts of good reasons for it. However, what's interesting, and where I find it interesting, is that the focus is, or the motivation is, very heavily geared towards achieving a result, a goal, target setting. It's all very focused around, what can you now do? What's your PB at this? What can you lift? What's your high rocks time? What's your what's your CrossFit game? It's all very, very, very heavily focused around that. And what has been kind of lost, or maybe never even existed, is people just exercising to just be. You know, I mean, it kind of goes back to my point about I want to be able to jump on my bike and cycle, or I want to be able to kind of run to wherever I need to get to. I don't want to get too bogged down in targets and goals, but targets and goals and achievements translate very nicely on Instagram to clicks and likes and advertising and sponsors and all that sort of stuff. So we've become so it's an interesting one. Whenever people say to me, "Oh, yeah, social media's been good," you only have to look at the statistics on how many people are out of shape and overweight and suffering from diabetes and cancers and heart. Yeah. But we people think we've kind of come out of COVID and now everyone's kind of rushed off to the gym. The reality is that most people haven't. Most people have got worse, but a small number of people who are very visual because they're on Instagram have taken it to another level. So.
And if you think of that level we were talking about, like a restorative, martial, like they're doing pedagogy, it mightn't just be sport. As you said, it's like it's very tilted towards. Another thing Ed Thomas would talk about was like just the importance of the technique, or what you said, like just doing a certain level of exercise to be healthier. So maybe you don't, when you lift your top up and you're like, you know, fasted for a while and you've done the right things, it doesn't look as impressive, but it's just like you feel like you've way more energy, you're able to do things healthier. And that's like, as you said, that's too nuanced for a photo. And again,
yes.
And like that, where with a lot of these things, it's like, oh, how many can you do? So like the form is sacrificed, or it's like, I'm just going to lift because that'll look more impressive. And again, there isn't that balance. Even though it's not soccer, it's essentially gone towards that. Like I lecture, and one thing we'd always talk about like would be the bench press, for example. I'd have a lot of guys and they're like, oh, well, I arch my back loads because they see powerlifters do it. But like they'll tell you a lot of things about shoulder stability. It's not. It's like if you arch your back loads, so if you get your chest up, you don't have to bring the bar down as far to complete the rep. Now, because it's using strengthening exercises, which traditionally wouldn't have been associated with pedagogy, it wouldn't have been associated with like sport and games. People then get confused with like, oh, well, that's not games, so that must be in this category, but it's not. It's like it's closer to the games. It's just about like, here are certain rules, I can bend it. So it's the same with like people doing like, if you have to do as many as possible, and it doesn't matter about technique, it's as many as possible. Like they will sacrifice a lot of things that a normal person should be doing. And again, like as you said, Instagram is nearly a game where people are going to be showing you crazy things and forgetting like, look, you are probably closer to just being a normal person. So the second element of your thing was you see people doing like deadlifts and like hard exercises. Like a lot of times it's like, look, we need, like when you're with the back, but the same when we're in there, a stepwise approach. Can we do the easier exercises, body weight, where we're comfortable with our technique, and gradually improve over time? And then really, as I think your thing is way healthier in terms of you can have a really good body, you can be in very good shape and not have to risk things. So I don't know if you want to talk about it now. We were talking about potentially like, are deadlifts worth it?
Yeah, let's actually before we get we'll come on to that in a second. That's what we'll do next. We'll do deadlifts. Actually, it's interesting because I was talking to somebody recently, a sports scientist guy, and we were talking about how what I want to try and transition my fitness into over the next kind of 6 months is, and it also ties in with the fact that I'm moving house soon. We're planning to move into the middle of nowhere, and so I'm trying to kind of embrace nature. And I was saying to him how, animals don't exercise; they just simply exist, and that keeps them fit and healthy. And I want to be like that. And he told me something which was fascinating, which is if you take, and they've done studies, and I'm paraphrasing what he told me slightly, but so I might be slightly off track. But the gist was, they've taken things like kind of mouse wheels that you'd give a mouse in a cage to run on, and they've stuck them in a forest. where mice have no need to jump on a wheel and run around, but they will still do it. Rodents are almost genetically predisposed to enjoying running. And so the question was, do animals exercise? He was saying that, through kind of genetic predisposition, some animals do seem to exercise, for want of a better word. They seem to do activity that apparently yields no obvious benefit. They're not scrounging for food or looking. Yeah, and also he had another one where they've looked at birds that instead of flying straight home, will kind of detour and basically just fly around. And again, the bird isn't thinking. The bird's not thinking, I need to go and work out. It's just genetically predisposed to doing things that we would regard as exercise. Thus, when the mouse does have to run away from a predator, it's in tip-top shape. And that I found even more fascinating, that animals should just have a predisposition to enjoying and wanting to move and not, let's take the word exercise out, just move. If you live, it's very hard when you live in the middle of a city, but if you live out in the countryside, I'm hoping that when I walk out of my front door, I just sort of tap into that kind of primal compulsion to just move through my environment because that's a good thing to be doing. The same as a mouse just is compelled to jump on a wheel, even if it's in a forest, and just go for a run anyway. I'm hoping that I find that. And I'm very excited about a world that I can hopefully show on YouTube where I am doing that. I am not exercising, inverted commas, but I'm rattling through calories and I'm getting stuff done, and it's very good for me. But what's interesting is that I'm then also thinking, how on earth do I translate that to Instagram? Because it's much easier on Instagram to put a photograph of me at the track saying I just ran a 60-second 400 meters than it is to say, here's me walking through a forest. And yet, arguably, going for a walk in a forest is probably much better for you in all sorts of ways than just rattling around a track once. So it's an interesting one that social media has it has a power, but the power isn't necessarily with necessarily the best people to wield it, because it kind of just sits with to stereotype slightly, it sits with Gymshark athletes, which is if that was a niche of fitness, it would be okay, but it's almost simply fitness, and clearly it very much isn't.
Yeah, and one thing you have to remember is, like, back in the day, if you were comparing yourself, like, say if you're 50, Mark, like, that's incredible, like the shape you're in. So if you were in any like normal town, you'd be like the fittest 50-year-old by a mile. But like you can go on Instagram and see guys, or some 50-year-olds would see you and think, oh God, no, I need to
absolutely
increase. So people sometimes can see like Gymshark models and being like, oh my God, no, this is what they're doing to this. It's like it'd be like if you were watching LeBron James,
yes.
Like you're pretty much at the same, like a lot of, like on the female equivalent, if they're not into elite sport, there's a lot of women who probably could have, if they probably weren't interested in sport, but then got into the gym, who are like, you're talking like the top, in genetic terms, like 0.001% of people.
Yeah.
So if they were doing Pilates, if they were doing gym, if they were doing running, they're going to have a very good body. So sometimes then we can think, oh, well, the reason they have it, and it is element, of course it is, but and as well, you don't see like what exactly they're doing. You're only seeing like, they're like, what, like you said, Mark, they're like, well, maybe they're doing this other stuff, but that's kind of boring, or it's hard to put up onto Instagram. So I'm just going to show this part of the training.
Yeah. And also you say it's boring. It's in simple terms, it doesn't sell.
Yeah.
If your Instagram, and for a lot of, I make the point as often as I can that I'm not a fitness YouTuber. I make films and end up on YouTube, and that is it. That is my job. So every time, 5 times a day, someone says, "Can you advertise this? Can we promote that?" No, I don't make adverts. Full stop. But the majority of fitness influencers aren't, and also don't kind claim to be. They aren't filmmakers. They're not. They're not as pretentious as me. They're simply in it to make a living. And so when a sponsor says, talk about My Protein or Gymshark or Athletic Greens, whatever it might be, they'll say yes, because they will happily make adverts. And then they have a responsibility to effectively their employers, in that sense, to present a certain image. I have no boss other than I have no boss other than my audience. So I simply present whatever state I'm in. But if I was thinking, oh my goodness, I've put on 10 kilos because I've had a bad back, I better not show any photographs, because if I do, My Protein are going to pull my sponsorship because I now look like a sack of potatoes. I wouldn't be putting those photographs up. I'd just be sandbagging photographs from last year, and people would still think I was in tip-top shape.
And that happens so much. The thing is, this is me. I'm great. And then there's always this post of I was living in hell. Now I'm living the real me. It's it nearly happens every one of them.
Yeah, no, it's grim. Okay, we can't fix social media, unfortunately. Let's get back to deadlifts. I used to do deadlifts and got up to about 450 pounds, so a couple of hundred kilos. And every time I did them, I thought, my back feels like it's going to explode. This can't be good. This can't be what the human body is designed to do, especially when it's 6'6". So in simple terms, are deadlifts worth it? And I mean social media deadlifts. I mean heavy deadlifting, strapping on the belt, people using rubber bands to hold the plates on because they've got so many on the damn bar. Is that for most people worth it? Are the benefits of deadlifting worth what appears to be potential to really mess yourself up?
No. Even the...
Good. There we go.
Thank you, guys.
Suck on that, Gymshark.
But even a guy who is a powerlifter, powerlifter, he was on Joe Rogan, and he was saying that elite college teams don't...
wasn't that? Yeah, was that... It wasn't Brian Shaw, was it? Or maybe it was. But it was one of the world's strongest men guys, wasn't it? And he said, unless you are doing it and earning a living from it, it is not worth it's not worth it. Because
you know what we were talking about? But we can do that hinge action perfect, because if you do a rack pull, which essentially a rack pull deadlift would be, if we take our hands and we just push our hips back as far as the hips will go back, we push our hips back. So say we slightly bend our knee, and then we push the hips back as far as they'll go. Now, you see, my hips won't go back any further. So if I want to get to the ground, I will have to round through my back. That's when the issue will come.
So out of interest, in your position there, your hands, because I like doing rack pulls, because the man in me likes to pick up a big heavy bar. The terrified man in me doesn't want to pick it up off the floor. So at what level should I be setting the rack for a rack pull? Where, obviously everyone's arms are different lengths and so on, but are we talking about mid-thigh?
Exactly. Knee? And your hip mobility is different. So I'd rather than that. So if you do it without the bar first, have your hands, let your hands kind of go down your lap or your quads, pushing your hips back. And when the hips stop moving backwards, see where your hands are.
Right.
So some people that'll be mid-thigh.
Yeah.
That's the point, because after that then, and you have, there's an argument about back flexion, not back flexion. Is it needed? Look, I think people can, there's the thing, people can adapt, or other people like myself would be look, keep the back in that neutral spine. I'm not going to be here and say there's not debate about that. There is. You'll get some research where they'll say it's the safest position. You'll get some research saying the backs can adapt. But this is beyond doubt now. When people are doing a deadlift, they are doing it to work on the glutes and hamstrings. It's a leg exercise. It's a leg exercise with core stability. So you want to be maintaining the core and working the glutes. Nobody is doing a deadlift for mobility of the back, functional mobility, to be able to lower and come back up. And if they are, so anyone who's saying that, oh, well, I tell people they can round their back doing a deadlift. It's like, okay, is the goal of this exercise flexibility of the back under load? And if that is the goal of the exercise, tell the person that's the goal of the exercise. So what we're working on here is erector spinae and core muscles to be able to work at your back. And the person probably say, no, I'm kind of doing it for the glutes and my legs. Okay, well then you can do a rack pull deadlift. Because when you're pushing your hips back, once you stop moving through here and now you're rounding through here, that you're not getting any more benefit through the legs or through the glutes. All the movement now is coming through the back, which is a different exercise. It's working a different part. So I think it, like, that kind of maddens me sometimes when they're like, well, I think you can flex or I think you can't. That's not the issue. This is a leg exercise where they're trying to maintain the core. So again, unless it is a competition where you will have to lift the heaviest weight possible off the ground, well, then you need to have, you'll get that hip mobility, but you need that flexibility in the back because you're doing a sport. It's a different thing.
Yes. And like any sport, you can decide whether the risks of that sport are worth it or not.
Exactly. It's like, but if you were doing it for aesthetics, fitness, and like the deadlift is your leg exercise. So if the leg exercise, and we want to keep the back, I believe that would keep the back safer because you're not going in. Look, anytime you go to an extreme range, like if I take my shoulder, if I'm back at the very end range, the amount I can move before an issue occurs is less. I'm not debating if someone is strong, if someone has stability, they can maintain that range and they can be very strong in that outer range. But you can't, like mechanically, you can't deny that is an issue. That's another thing. I know we're not going back on social media where just the amount of information, as you said, and if you're given just common sense stuff, it's just like people even if they're not doing it, they're kind of blasé to that information. So you kind of want to go for like the startling things, like say the Jefferson curl, which is like you hold a weight and you're like curling all the way down through your back. Like if
knees over toes guy I've seen him doing a lot of stuff like that.
And like, but if you look at his stuff, when he says it, it's like, okay, do it pain free. That's fine because it could take you a long time. Like there's no doubt you can learn that. But like, look at a lot of times the people doing this, they're very strong. They're like maybe in their 20s, they don't have a back issue, so it's easy to do these things if you have the control.
Yeah. So if you do rack, I mean, I love doing it. I can do 200 kilo rack pulls for reps all day long. But if I try and pick 200 kilos off the floor from a deadlift, I mean, it's touch and go as to whether I'm going to walk out the gym.
And like that, sorry, just one more point on that. With these, again, if you're not doing it for max strength, like do a few extra reps, going at 80%, you should always have at least 2 or 3 in reserve, I think. Though, again, like it's just like the risk reward, is the juice worth a squeeze? Yes. The day you hurt your back, you'll be kicking yourself going like you said, I have loads of people come in and it's like, you know what, I was doing it. You get into a mindset of, I want to get stronger. They're in the shape they want to be. And I just kept going. And then they're kicking themselves because they're like, maybe instead never have a 1 rep max. There's all these calculators that could estimate like a 3 or a 4 rep max. And you can type in, I did 4 reps at this weight. This is 1 rep max, but never go for a 1 rep max. It's just not worth the risk. The juice is not worth the squeeze. Always keep it at a 3 or 4 rep, or even 5, of a little bit less.
Absolutely. But nowadays, not having a 1 rep max is almost, the way I view it almost is, I can remember as a youngster, my friends we'd go out drinking. My friends would all drink. I would never drink. I just never enjoyed drinking. To this day, I'm not teetotal, but I hardly ever drink. It just doesn't, I'd rather have a Diet Coke. And I am the sort of personality who quite enjoyed being different to everyone else. So I couldn't, maybe that's why I'm now doing a weird job. So I enjoyed that. People were, why aren't you having a drink? I'll talk to people all day long about why I do things differently to them. One of the reasons I'm vegan is, I mean, partly for the animals, but partly
yeah.
just annoy people that think I shouldn't be vegan. So I'm just kind of living my life slightly confrontationally. So the reason I mention it is that I was asked recently on someone else's podcast about my athletic abilities, and they said, right, and they wanted to know what's your max squat, and I said, I haven't got a clue. And I quite liked the fact that I haven't got I've got no idea what a max squat is. I've never tried to do my max squat. I did my max bench press once in 50 years. I mean, it really just doesn't interest me. And I enjoy being the person who can say, don't know, don't care. In the same way as when people say to me, oh, are you on Strava for your cycling? No, don't care. And most cyclists kind of throw their hands up in horror. If it didn't happen, it's not on Strava, it didn't happen. But most people, in the same way that most of my friends when we were younger felt compelled to drink because everyone was drinking, most people watching social media will just feel compelled to know what their 1 rep max is, to train to failure. They'll see, guys like Dorian Yates. I saw Dorian Yates on Instagram the other day, training with someone. I mean, the guy's 7 times Mr. Olympia. I'm sure he can train to failure quite well and knows what he's doing. But is that what Joe Bloggs should be doing on day one in the gym, training until lifting until you can't lift another rep? And a lot of people will be saying yes. And I always enjoyed going against the grain. And unfortunately, social media is it's not an easy environment to go against the grain on. You have to be a little bit naturally confrontational to do that. And most people just get suckered into thinking, no, I need to know my maxes. And it's good. It's good. It's good that people can hear from an expert, not just me rabbling on, that if you never push your max lift, as you say, the juice is not worth the squeeze. So as I was going to say, just with the rack pulls, if you're doing rack pulls, as you said, we're working the glutes, we're working the hamstrings. I like rack pulls because it works my grip strength. So when I go and do a high rocks or something, I pick up the farmer's carry. If I can rack pull 200 kilo for 10 reps, I can certainly do a farmer's carry with a couple of dumbbells. So I like it for that. What are we missing? Is there something that, because we've taken deadlifts out and we've put rack pulls in, that something else should be incorporated as well to fill in the gap? Or are we saying rack pulls have got it all covered?
Yeah, because if you think about it, like what we're doing there is a hip hinge. A deadlift is a hip hinge. Yep. So what we're doing is we are just maximizing the amount of hinge we actually have. And what we're saying is the majority of the world does not have the range of motion at the hip to hip hinge away from the floor. So what they have is what we're saying is the purest way. We're saying you're going to do a rack pull deadlift, or you're going to do like a kettlebell swing, because that's your max hip hinge range, and that's what this is. We're doing a kind of hip dominant exercise, and then we'll have squats, which are knee dominant exercises. What lifting from the floor is they're like, we're doing a hip hinge and a kind of back flexion, back extension exercise.
So on that point, then, are we? So basically, spinal erector muscles, those muscles in either side of the lower back, they are not being worked in the rack pull the way they are being worked in the deadlift. There's
a difference between core stability and core strength. Core stability is the ability to hold, and I believe that the lower back and the core,
and they're doing that. They're working isometrically in that way.
So they are working to resist the motion, which I believe those muscles are kind of designed for. So,
So in that case, do we need, if we're doing rack pulls, we're not doing deadlifts, do we need to do some lower back kind of spinal erector muscle type work that is dynamic? Should we be doing lying back extensions and stuff like that? Or
no, I don't keep that in, because I think I rather just do core stability work. I don't think the back is really, look, you'll need to do it. Now, if you're doing without weight, then you can do a flexibility work if you want. But generally, again, this is like, we're talking about for the 95 percentile. If you're in the 95 to 0%, which most of us are, if we're in the general pop, we're stiff through the hips. we're moving too much anyway through the back. Like if we're sitting, we're like rounded at our back. So we're getting a lot of movement at the lower back. What we need to do is improve the range of motion at the hip and actually improve the stability in the back. So when we get those elements, and then you're like, well, I want to work on this flexibility. Yeah, no bother. But if make sure that we're getting all the pieces of the puzzle up to that. So I'm gonna work core stability. I'm gonna work like a farmer's carry, like anti-flexion, anti-extension, anti-side flexion. I want to try work a controlled way through my core. So can I move through because if you think of any motion, generally it's like a transfer of force through the core. There's no, like, if you're throwing a punch or kicking, there's no action where you're also having to like include your back. Normally it's you're running, you step, the core should transfer the force that's generated through the powerful legs, through the core, and through the terminal segment, which is the arm. Or you stand on one leg and you need the core to hold things stable so you can kind of swing and kick with the other leg. Or you're running, you're moving your arms and leg, and you need the core again to stabilize. But we do these random things where we're like, oh, well, I need to get, should we add like that flexion through the back or extension? It's like, there's nothing functionally you ever really do unless you're talking about something abstract that works the body that way. But I've mentioned punching, throwing, kicking, running, jumping, that need the core to be stable so you can transfer force through. So if there's something outside of running, jumping, kicking, throwing, punching, that's functional, please let me know, where you need to be able to move the lower back in extension and flexion for a functional, practical human.
Yeah. So in simple terms then, if you are doing decent weight rack pulls, you're working your lower back isometrically, and that is perfectly good enough to keep it fit and healthy and stable.
The back, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, awesome. My last question. I want to finish up on this because, as I mentioned a couple of times, I'm currently sitting down. When we finish talking, I'm going to get up because I have adopted a philosophy of sit down as little as possible. To the point that it now annoys people. For example, I'll often be with my wife. We'll be going to friends or something, and everyone will be sat down, and I'll be stood up, and people say sit down. I say no, I've been sat down for ages. I'm happy to stand, and it looks very weird. And again, because I'm the sort of person that doesn't care, I ignore that, but I do look a bit odd standing everywhere. I now might start squatting instead.
Just for you on that, I wouldn't. Unless you're holding on to something, it would take you a while because you will flex at your back. They've adapted that over time. I would do some deep flexion. I would probably hold on to something.
I need to carry something
heavy out in front of you. Yeah. And a little bit of it's perfect, but the strategy you're doing currently, I would stay doing.
So in simple terms, am I as right 100%. As I am to be not afraid,
100%.
but avoiding sitting? Because like, for example, I have a chair. The chair that I'm sat on now it's a stool actually, and it can go up real high. So when I do stand, as I stand at my desk, it's a standing desk most of the time. If I do want to take a break because I literally get tired, I can sit on it, but it's like a bar stool. My legs are that hip angle is very. It's not straight, but it's not like it is now. And I keep getting kind of Google adverts and Facebook adverts and so on for, this chair is the most ergonomic chair ever. It's great for your back. And I look at it and think, no, you're still sat down. If you are sat down with a 90-degree or thereabouts hip angle, that is not going to be good for your back. Am I right to be that kind of dismissive of sitting down? And should everyone listening to this stop sitting?
100%. Kelly Starrett says sometimes your next position is your best position. So changing constantly is probably the best thing we can do.
Right.
Because again, we're kind of putting that pressure on the front that can put pressure out in the back. So there was a nice study that looked at office workers with back pain. And one group, if you got up 1 minute for every hour, at the end of the day, your back pain was roughly the same as it was at the start of the day. If you sat for like the majority of your 8 hours, when at the start of the day, you might have on average, it was like a 2 out of 10 pain. At the end of the day, it was a 7 out of 10 pain. So taking regular micro breaks is really important. It kind of just allows, we've talked about if you held your finger back, the way you just instinctively what you would do is like you'd bend it in the opposite direction. So if we're constantly like flexed, by standing, you're kind of arching and essentially opening back up, getting out of that position, and doing that for every hour you're sitting. Trying to stand for at least 1 minute is a really good piece of advice. Now, what I would say to that is sometimes people, like, they're working, they're like, I just can't stand. What I would say is I'm in my chair here. I come to the edge of my chair and then I drop one knee to the ground. Okay, so I'm at the very edge of my chair. What that's going to do is essentially going to be like I'm in a standing position. So I'm not going to be flexed at my back. I'm going to be arched. And then we talked about the hip flexor. One thing we didn't say is that the iliopsoas or hip flexor actually starts on the back, comes through the stomach, and then attaches onto the leg. So it's actually on the lumbar spine. So if we drop that leg, we're stretching and opening up that hip flexor again. And I'll hold, and I can be happily in this position for, say, 2 minutes, and then just switch leg for 2 minutes. And then if I have to go back to the position I was in. The last thing I would say, if we're driving or if we're doing things, a rolled up towel, and you sit as far back into the chair as you can, or into your seat when you're driving as you can, and you get a rolled up towel and you put that in the small of your back, in that arch position. Because again, there's a natural lordosis in the back, and when we're sitting, we're kind of flexing or losing that lordosis. So if we have a towel or something right in there, pushing hard against it, like initially it should nearly jut you in, but like the towel will kind of deform as you come against it. That will help you keep that natural curve a little bit more. So regular standing.
It's interesting because every car I've had, all the cars I've had lately at least have had a lumbar support, but that lumbar support in the car, even at its maximum, is nothing compared to just the simple process of putting a towel in there. It's
too low down.
Makes
I
no
find
difference. So if you're thinking, oh, I've got the lumbar support, useless. And at the moment, driving around looking for houses to buy, we're often driving for hours and hours, and I've been putting as you say, a rolled up towel in my back, and the other thing, when I get out of the car, because one of the things I was finding was I'd stand up from sitting down at my desk or in the car. My hip flexors are tight; they're pulling on my back. They throw my pelvis into that anterior pelvic tilt, so I kind of that sort of duck walk position. So even when I'm stood up, I'm not actually straight. I'm permanently kind of. So even though I'm thinking, I'm standing up now, I'm not actually straightened out. So I now when I get out of the car, I actively stretch and properly reposition my body. I've become acutely aware of. I'll look in the mirror or look in the window of the car for my reflection and think, actually, am I straight? Because just because I'm stood up, I'm not always straight. I noticed when my back was at its worst, I'd feel straight. And then Jen would say to me, what are you doing? You're walking around like, Max Stool is a reference that only people over the age of about 60 will get, but that kind of duck walk position, leant forward, but didn't even feel like it. I felt like I was upright and tall. Now I look in the mirror and I think, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not as straight as I should be. So it's good to hear that me avoiding chairs is the right way to go, and I'm not being overly
No,
fussy.
I think so. And I think, as I said, little micro breaks for every hour if you can set it, or at least come to the front of your chair, drop the hip down, and then if we're having it in a chair, your rolled up towel, bring an extra. If I'm on a flight, I will always, it's always easy, with Ryanair baggage costs, it's always best to have an extra jumper on. So, people are like, how am I going to get this? How am I get all these clothes on holidays? Put on an extra jumper, going onto the flight, take it off, roll that up, and now you have a nice little support in the lower part of the back to keep the back in that arch when you're flying.
The micro breaks thing is interesting because what I've started doing on my iPhone is when I sit down to write a script or anything that I can kind of find myself immersed in or editing footage and end up just forgetting that I've been there for 2 or 3 hours. Before I start, I just do, I won't say it because if I say Siri, it will trigger it. I say, hey, and I tell the phone, set countdown timer for 30 minutes. And when it goes ping, I get up and I leave the office. I go for a walk. I do something different. I never, because I was finding myself able to sit down and work, and suddenly 3 or 4 hours are gone, and I wouldn't have even realised. And then I try and stand up, and I'm just a mess. And by then it's 2 o'clock in the morning because we're working. I then go to bed in a mess, wake up, can't move, and I'm thinking that's a puzzle. Why has that happened? And looking back, it's
you see that we see with gardening as well. I think that's one where you kind of get into, a lot of people get into their garden.
Yep.
They're working or they're doing something, and like having an alarm, because what you want to do is like stop it before it kind of becomes an issue. And then again, and that kind of builds a capacity in the back, but we need to do that gradually over time.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Actually, it's funny, just to finish off on that one, but because we're looking at houses to buy that are in the middle of nowhere that might need a bit of work, I've started looking at various renovation projects online, which means Instagram is constantly now feeding me kind of workers restoring buildings and so on. And I'm looking at all of them thinking, dude, your back is going to be a mess. What are you doing? Yeah, they're bricklayers or whatever. They're bent over. They're stooped, or they're doing plumbing and they're underneath cupboards. And I wonder how many of those guys at any point during their day do any sort of mobility or stretching work or anything. And for those guys, if you're a self-employed plumber and your back goes, that's a whole, you can't do what I do and just make a video about it and make some money. That's a bad day. But I wonder how many of those guys are ever doing anything like
that. As you said, it's something, if you are a plumber, if you're in those, if you can early on make it a routine, as Mark was saying, this should be part of like your health and safety, essentially, because even long term, I couldn't tell you how many people I've seen who've had to stop those type of careers because they're just crocs.
And yet, can you imagine a guy arriving at a building site and kind of warming up, inverted commas, and doing some stretching? Everybody would laugh at him, and yet he's the guy that if he doesn't do it, will end up having to come and see you or someone like you because he can't go and earn a crust anymore.
Well, Roy Keane used to talk about that with like, they used to be laughing at Ruud van Nistelrooy, like he'd be doing these like exercises or they'd be like hammering to attack. He's like, no, I'm just like going to do, yoga, or he'd be like, he's going off to do yoga. Yes. And then it's like, he was chatting to him and Ruud van Nistelrooy's playing nearly to 40 and like Roy Keane he's like, my hip was, I could barely like kick a ball with my kids, so yeah, it's funny. Sometimes it's said you do have to be the contrarian, and you'd be surprised, like you have obviously seen this. I always saw that in houses that I lived in, just with healthy eating. When I was sharing in college or whatever, there is a tip, like people, you probably see it because if you are a contrarian, people can't handle imbalance. And I was always the way where it's like, I'm not, it won't go to takeaways. Like, I don't mind if you have takeaways forever, but I know I'm not going to go there. Like I'll have one where so often, but that won't be the routine. You will see me eat a lot of veg, having these dinners, cooking them. And invariably, a lot of times, if you're strong, what happened is like another runner who'd be living in the house be like, yeah, I'll jump in for those dinners. He'd make them. And by the end of the year, it'd be like all 4 of us would be making the dinners and they'd be coming up with healthy recipes, because it's a weird thing. You can't have it. So if you did start those things, even though it might seem really strange in the start, if you got 1 or 2 others, all of a sudden, like the whole place could be doing it.
I have now an idea for a YouTube video where I go to building sites and basically test the mobility of guys that are bricklaying and so on. Actually, indeed, yeah, that might be quite funny. Eoin, it's been awesome chatting. It's a fascinating subject because it's so personal to me, but it's so personal to so many people clearly. That have contacted me and said they've suffered with their back in a similar way. So great to hear some tips and some advice. So thank you for that. I'm off to now purchase one of those little stools to put in front of my toilet so that I can go like nature intended, I guess is the best way to describe it. Thanks again. Yeah, indeed, it's been a fascinating insight.
Brilliant. If anybody just wants to learn more, I have a free quiz on like what potentially is causing your back pain. It's at backaware belt. So backaware belt, all one word, .com/quiz. And it's a free 1-minute quiz. If people are like, is my back pain caused by disc problems? Is it more SI joint? It's a facet joint. It's not obviously 100% accurate, but it gives you some idea and then gives you some ideas of what you should do kind of to fix it. So yeah, thanks so much, Mark. I really enjoyed this.
Awesome. And we'll also, we'll stick all the links as well in the descriptions on these on YouTube and the podcast. So anybody wants to go and find that, they can just go there and click and get through and take your quiz and see what's wrong with them.
Great, Mark. Thanks. And anytime you want me back on, or if people have follow-up questions, I'd love to be back on. I love this one. Thank you so much.
Superb. Thank you.